Hi, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. This is the session on adaptation finance in uncertain times. My name is May, and I'm a senior researcher at IED. We have an exciting lineup for the session today, and the purpose of the session is to talk about how we are going to deal with the uncertainties in the development sector today, the difficult financial and political situations that we're facing. And we'll hear from different climate funders, from government, from philanthropy, from banks, from the vertical climate funds, about how they're going to approach the context that we're in. Okay, without further ado, I will run through the agenda. So we'll have an intro right now, running through the agenda, and then my colleague Paul will give a scene setting for why we decided to have the session today. We'll then go into breakout groups, and if you joined the opening plenary this morning, you'll have heard about the reverse panel concept, where we put you in a breakout room as the audience, and you come up with questions that you want to ask the panelists. Afterwards, we'll bring you all back to the plenary. I'll collate the questions, and then we'll ask the panelists their perspectives based on your questions. We'll then have the panel discussion, and afterwards, we'll just have a closing and reflections on what you've heard so far. Does that sound okay with everyone in the room? Okay, I hope so, because I can't see anyone. Um, and I'll hand over to my colleague Paul to give us the opening context. Thanks.
Thanks, May, and hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. And to wherever you are in the world, whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening, we're really excited to have you here. Okay, so let's jump in. I'm going to make some opening remarks, as May said, and then we'll get a little bit crazy with our reverse panel idea, and then we will jump into the conversation. So to start with, I guess I wanted to say that the world is a different place to when we first came together or last came together for D&C Days. But I've lost count of the number of times that I've heard and said words to that effect this year. But I guess there is a reason that we keep repeating those kinds of words because the world is a different place in many ways. And for the purposes of this conversation in particular, the adaptation finance landscape has altered dramatically in the last 12 months. Just to cite a few examples, we've seen the complete dismantling of the world's largest ODA provider by volume. The top 10 largest bilateral donors by volume have all announced cuts of between 10 and 40% to their ODA going forward. ODA flows in 2026 are likely to be at least 20% lower than in 2025. And these are important issues because the vast majority of adaptation finance is drawn from ODA budgets. The vast majority of publicly available adaptation finance is drawn from government's ODA budgets. In the good news column, climate finance overall is still growing, or at least was still growing in 2023, reaching a record of around $1.9 trillion. But, and there's always a but, more than half of that was from private sources, and that was the first time that private sources have overtaken public sources in our knowledge. And one of the challenges there is that private finance has mostly been allergic to adaptation historically. The investments are largely in mitigation over adaptation. And the lion's share, the biggest share of that private investment is actually from people in wealthy countries investing in things like solar panels and EVs for their own adaptation and mitigation benefit. The majority of the publicly available finance is in the form of commercial loans. And public finance actually dropped by 13% in 2023. So then of this whole 1.9 trillion, only 65 billion of that was allocated or tagged as adaptation finance. Again, most of this is loans, and minimal amounts of that are flowing to least developed countries and the small island developing states, and almost none directly to communities in the most climate vulnerable contexts. Something in the order of less than 0.2% of total climate finance makes it into the hands of people in communities. So this is a huge challenge. And of course, all of this is happening against a backdrop of ever increasing adaptation needs, reaching somewhere in the order of between 200 and 400 billion annually in most recent assessments, depending on who you ask and how you count. And I know there are some disputes about those figures, but I think what we can clearly say is there isn't enough money in the system to meet current needs, let alone projected ones. But this isn't a new story. We've known this for years, and I don't think we need to repeat those same conversations here about the need for more funding. It's a given. What we don't talk about often enough, though, is how well the funding that is available from whatever source is being used. How quality is just as important as quantity. And as we're seeing ODA constraints hit more and more, and other sources of finance either stepping up or stepping back, the quality of the finance that is available, how it's used effectively and efficiently will become an even more pressing conversation and a pressing issue. Just as, for example, energy efficiency is one of the lowest hanging fruits for mitigation outcomes, but it's not really sexy, so people don't talk about it. How we use effective and efficient ways to distribute and implement adaptation action could help us bridge some of these current funding gaps, but it's not a conversation that we have often enough, I think. We do also, though, then need to think around issues of who decides what's effective and efficient and to what end those decisions are made. So for this session, we've gathered together a group of really excellent people whose jobs include, one way or another, managing the disbursement of adaptation finance of different kinds. So we have in reverse alphabetical order by first name, because we're doing everything in reverse today. Saliha Dobrazik, lead programming and innovation unit at the Adaptation Fund. We've got Ramona Kalin, who's the locally led climate action specialist at the Green Climate Fund. Jared Howe is the Deputy Director, Climate Resilience Department in the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. Anna Heath, Senior Programs Manager with Synchronicity Earth. And Argo Sinha Roy, Climate Change Director at the Asian Development Bank. But before we turn to them, and I know they will all have an amazing amount of fascinating things to say, we wanted to get what you're interested in getting out of this session. So there's currently 50 odd of you in the room. So what we'd like to do, instead of a traditional panel session that's full of set pieces followed by not enough time for Q&A, we're going to flip things around and get you discussing the key issues first in what we're calling a reverse panel. So in a couple of minutes, what we'll do is send you into breakout groups of around 10 people per group. We're going to give you 5 minutes to have a very quick conversation about the sorts of stuff you're interested in hearing from our esteemed panel members. Ideally, this will take the form of one question, but it could just be a few keywords or things that occur to you that are of interest within the ambit of this session. Please, no essays. Pick one person in the group to report back. And then when you come back into the plenary, what we'd like to do is that one person to put your group's question or your keywords or whatever you've come up with into the chat. I'm going to then ask an opening leading question to the panel. And while they're responding to that question, my colleague May will filter through the chat and pull out some of the key themes and ideas and key questions that are coming through. And then we'll start a conversation more broadly with the panel. Hopefully that all makes sense. We're going to put you into breakout groups now. I'm looking across it at May. Please just accept you'll be randomly assigned. Hopefully you meet someone new and interesting, but do focus on the issue at hand. What are the key things that you would like to hear about adaptation finance and most specifically, how we use it well going forward? And then we'll come back and have a really interesting conversation. So welcome back. I hope you had some productive and interesting conversations. I know they were very short. If you were nominated by your group, please do pop in your question or your keywords or your stream of consciousness, hopefully very concisely into the chat so we can harvest those for questions for the panel. If your group didn't nominate somebody, please do step up and pop some things into the chat so that we have some fodder for the panelists. They're all eagerly awaiting the kinds of information that you are interested in drawing out of them. So please do that. And while May works through those inputs, I'm going to ask the panelists a first question. And again, we will go in that reverse order by first name because it's fun. So my question is, to each of the panelists, can you tell me in 1 minute something innovative that you or your organization are doing to keep momentum on adaptation during these uncertain times? So we'll start with Saliha, and it's very early in Washington, so apologies, Saliha. Please jump in.
Thank you, Paul, and apologies to you all, because indeed it's quite early, but I will try to keep it brief and succinct. So as many of you know, the Adaptation Fund was founded with several key objectives or components to its mission, one of which is to promote direct access. And we have tried to remain true to that mission. So we work through national institutions directly to deliver finance on the ground. And I think what that has been innovative, but where we're trying to go further with being innovative is strengthening further inclusive finance channels, particularly for people who are especially vulnerable to climate change. And we're doing that starting to do that more, I would say, with international financial institutions, MDBs, and so on. We are also keen to provide grant finance for subnational and local actors and entities, and we're doing that through our locally led adaptation funding opportunities. And lastly, we are strengthening the innovation ecosystem locally, starting from grassroots, whereby through our, for example, Adaptation Fund Climate Innovation Accelerator, we're providing small grants to local innovators addressing local adaptation challenges. So we're trying to move locally, ever more locally, and that is the innovative direction that we are moving towards.
Thanks so much, Saliha. That's a really good point to start us off on. And I'm noticing some things coming in the chat there around how financiers can think through or really support local priorities in their work they're doing. So you've kind of preempted some of those questions with your opening gambit there. So that's really helpful. Thank you. So jumping across to Ramona. Ramona, what is one innovative thing that the GCF is doing to help keep momentum on adaptation?
Thank you, Paul, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. I don't know if this is innovation per se, but I can't help but reflect on this because at the Green Climate Fund, we're actually closing the last board meeting of the year today, at which $1.4 billion were allocated to new projects. Of these, 1 billion for adaptation, ranging from really smaller scale projects of just 8 million through some direct access national entities to much larger scale programs sort of on countrywide adaptation programs of 100 and 200 million. So I don't know if there's innovation in scale, but I suppose continuing to allocate resources available for adaptation is definitely not insignificant. And just to tag on to that, a growing focus on not just the volume, but the quality of funding through ongoing work on structuring our locally led climate action approach, which is essentially my job and focus sort of 100% of the time at the GCF, and then looking at how to strengthen focus of adaptation on locally led climate action, working across governments, communities, and private sector.
Thanks, Ramona. And one super brief follow-up. Was that the first time that, maybe you don't know this statistic to hand, but is that the first time that the GCF has allocated more finance for adaptation at a board meeting than mitigation?
Probably not. There isn't, I think, a constant trend, and board meetings do vary in terms of just which portfolios are available. The mandate is to keep the portfolio always at half and half between adaptation and mitigation, and at least half of adaptation resources for LDC, SIDS, and African states. So that's an ongoing target, but I wouldn't actually know I would say there isn't a constant trend. It probably just varies in terms of how projects mature.
Thanks, Ramona. It wasn't a very fair follow-up, so it's a fair response. And I'm sure people will be really interested to hear more about the LLCA guidance that you're developing. So then, okay, over to you, Gerard. So in terms of what the UK government is doing, something innovative or interesting that is happening in order to keep momentum on adaptation.
Great, thanks, Paul, and hello, everybody. It's really nice to be here. I think I'd just say we need to think about this in three ways, right? One is an overall approach, and therefore the UK government is trying to be innovative in taking a systemic and interconnected approach. And it isn't just keeping momentum, right? We have to actually accelerate the momentum to get the transition to resilience we need, and that needs speed and scale. So I think we need to take a systemic and connected approach across the piece, connecting local and national. Secondly, there's a sort of innovative in how you do things, and I would offer a really great partnership in terms of Life AR, working alongside a set of countries who are committed to securing a minimum of 70% of finance being invested behind community prioritized investments. And we can talk about more about that. And then thirdly, innovation in what you do. We have a series of things where, for example, we're using AI alongside our Bangladesh colleagues to predict cyclone impacts and address embankment vulnerability. That worked really effectively in the Ramal cyclone in 2024. We're doing transformation labs in Dodoma in Tanzania, where communities are coming alongside government and technical experts to secure water resilience and move that forward. And we're doing some really interesting stuff alongside some Met offices looking at storm surge predictions and how we get better information to communities in advance of that. So I think we have to think at an overall level how we work and what we do. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Jared. I think that was much less than 1 minute. So, I mean, I'd be fascinated to hear more about the use of AI and large language models for early warning systems. I think that's quite interesting. And hopefully they don't go rogue and just make up storms, because we have obviously enough of those flowing around the world at the moment. I take your point too around it's not just about keeping momentum, but it's about accelerating momentum. And I look forward to hearing more from you on that as we continue this discussion, because you're absolutely right. Regardless of the funding situation, we actually need to be putting the pedal to the EV metal to really get things moving as the impacts scale up. So turning to you, Anna, so something that is happening in the philanthropy world, so with Synchronicity Earth, anything innovative and interesting going on the adaptation front.
Great, thank you, Paul. Yeah, as Paul mentioned, I'm representing philanthropy on this call. So I think in the philanthropic space, and particularly at Synchronicity Earth, something that's happening increasingly at the moment is kind of critical reflection on power and the power we hold as funders. And I think that's a really positive and exciting kind of step forward in how philanthropy is working. This has been something that Synchronicity Earth has been doing since our founding, but we've been increasingly continuing to reflect on how we can make our practices trust-based and like really effective for our local partners. So most of our grant partners are locally led small NGOs in the global south. And so figuring out how can philanthropic funding really build these organizations to have genuine power and to have the ability to make the changes that need to be made. And I think a big part of that from us is highly flexible funding, like allowing for changes, because all the work that we support is never predictable, and it's becoming more and more unpredictable as climate change charges forward. And I think another part of that is that I always want to highlight is we have no restrictions on how much of that funding can be used for salaries. I think supporting people to spend time on important work is incredibly valuable, and we hear it over and over and over again from all of our partners globally that they can never find any money to support their own work and their own time. And I think that's just a really important one to hit home. I'll probably hit my minute there, so I'll leave it there. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Anna. I think that I'm sure that would be music to many people in the room's ears, because that core institutional support can be really difficult to get hold of, and particularly for smaller organizations who are constantly chasing after project-based funding, not having the flexibility to build their own systems and processes for sustainability, I think is a critical issue. So that flexibility is great. There's also, a small bit of marketing, a session later on in the day, wherever you are, but in the afternoon in the UK on trust-based partnerships specifically. So hopefully many of you will be able to join that. Okay, so across to our final panelist, Argo, last but certainly not least, from the Asian Development Bank, what's happening in the world of the MDBs and particularly the ADB around innovations for pushing forward adaptation?
Thanks, Paul. I'm not sure if it qualifies as innovation, maybe that's a stretch of the word, but I would say new ways of engaging with our clients, and our clients are primarily governments. So new ways of engaging with them and strengthening their systems so governments are able to better engage with a wide range of stakeholders on adaptation and specifically on local level adaptations concerns. So for example, as a part of a wider financial package in Bangladesh, we needed requirements to have the government to come up with a locally led adaptation policy framework, which can help government strengthen the enabling environment that local private sector or communities would need for adaptation. Similarly, in Cambodia, we're trying to explore our nearly 2 decades of funding to smallholder farmers and women's group, how that funding can be designed differently so that funding actually interacts with government's decentralization systems, which are also funded by GCF over here, and see how that system can deliver adaptation solutions in the long term. And a country like Indonesia, where it's a larger country, the possibilities of mobilizing private financing for local adaptation is higher. We're trying to see how a government-backed and subsidized microcredit scheme can be designed differently so government subsidies are used in a much more smarter manner that can leverage adaptation finance from the private sector for smallholder farmers. So it's a way of working differently with government and ultimately building government systems for delivery. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Argo. And I'm sure people will be interested to hear more about the work that you're doing from an MDB perspective to really localize that funding. Sometimes we find that there are some disjunctures or some kind of less productive conversations about how the multilateral development banks can engage in locally led adaptation and how locally led things can really be when you're working through top-down government systems. So having you reflect more on that through this conversation will be really interesting. So that was our opening gambit. So hopefully people in the room have gotten a bit of a flavor of where things are headed and what's going on. We have, I think, a short list of currently 3 sort of top themes coming through in the chat from those breakout groups at the start. So we'll start with one of those, which is around local priorities. So this has come up actually in almost all of your answers to that first question around innovation. The word local came up a lot, the word or the ideas of locally led adaptation, whether that language was used, came up in your responses. So let's build on that a little bit. And the question that May has amalgamated from various bits of group chats is, and it's a long one, so apologies, how can funders ensure that local priorities are supported and there is strong accountability at the local level and from the funder without imposing greater M&E requirements? And I guess in this case, we're talking about kind of top-down extractive monitoring and evaluation and reporting requirements. So how can we really bridge that top-down, bottom-up approaches? I might turn, just throwing my reverse name situation out the window. Maybe we'll start with you, Gerard.
Within the Life AR program, and people may have attended the earlier session, right? So forgive me if they have, but I think that at the heart of that is about supporting government to work through its systems and its engagements with local communities to build that problem identification built up from community perspectives, problem solution built up from community perspectives, and then accountability for finance flowing through government systems on the principle, rightly, of accountability and subsidiarity towards that, right? And so for us within the Life AR community, absolutely the heart of that is government's own commitments and supporting them where we can to deliver that sort of that model of climate finance flowing to local level through subsidiarity, through governance, through transparency, and through evidence-based decisions at local level. So that is really important to us. And that was certainly something also that we talked about through at our Life AR, at our Wilton Park event in September of this year, when we brought together 50 stakeholders across the world to really think about how we take those forwards. And we've got top actions on that, including thinking about how we build on existing systems and processes to strengthen those institutions that support those approaches. So the thrust of this is clearly not to be imposing, as the question is, but to be supporting, and to be supporting a relationship and accountability and power structure that meets those needs at local levels to build a resilience in ways that are meaningful to local communities. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Jared. And Lavia, I mean, I think is an incredible example of doing things differently in the adaptation space. I do wonder if if you have any thoughts on how, because it is such a good example of doing things quite differently, but it's one example, whether that kind of approach or elements of that may permeate out into the broader investments that the UK, for example, has in adaptation.
Well, I think we're absolutely committed to putting locally led approaches and localization at the heart of everything that we do. And you can see that, for example, in the ways in which we work alongside Indigenous communities in forestry programs, in the way in which we think about development, in the way in which we try and support gender equality and women's rights movements through institutions like Gaga as they come and engage on climate action as well. So that runs through. It's also true, again, that a real subject of discussion at Wilton Park was how we support our colleagues across the system. You've got Ramona and Agia here as well, to be so that they are hearing at board level their stakeholder and contributors request to be putting LLA and locally led approaches at the heart of everything they do. And I think that's really important. And that partly is also about building the evidence and supporting the storytelling from local communities to really put that at the heart of reaction. So there is more work to be done there, but the principle is exactly right. Thanks.
Thanks, Jared. So just jumping around randomly alphabetically, maybe over to Ramona, just to think about some of that prioritization of local perspectives in the work that the GCF does on adaptation.
Thanks, Paul. I suppose just to build a bit on Gerard, and again, the GCF sort of invests across every single area of climate impacts and climate needs. And it's really sort of within this current strategic planning cycle, 2024 to 2027, that we've taken a more stronger focused look at locally led adaptation. And then taking a critical look at the portfolio so far over the last 9 years to basically say to what extent have we supported this so far. And because our work is done and implemented through such a wide range of partners, sort of ministries, non-governmental organizations, private sectors, there's a great variety through which we think we are supporting activities at a local level, and a very great variety to the extent to which that's institutionalized, a great variety in the degree to which funding is actually channeling at the local level, funding is decided at the local level, etc., etc., etc. So very wide spectrum of accountability mechanisms, engagement mechanisms, delivery channels, funding channels, etc. So the plan now, I think, is to bring all the good learning from that and make it a bit more structured and a bit more integrated, and to really, through this work on promoting locally led climate action and trying to scale both the numbers but the quality of investment in this, to have a much more robust from the beginning until the end of still project cycles, because that is how we work and how we fund, but having the entirety of these project cycles a bit more considerate. So really embedding solutions, co-design, participatory approaches from the beginning, but all the way through to actually having budgets and resources for participatory monitoring, for tracking of results where it's feasible. It's not always going to be valuable, but there are many areas of adaptation where it is valuable. Having that actually part of project budgets and having partners that work on this really incorporate that thinking from the beginning, not really as an ad hoc. So it's a learning journey. I think we've taken stock of what's happened so far, and there's good practices, but there's really a need to put a bit of a stronger sort of astronaut suit on it and make everything fit together in the context of a project. And that's sort of the process that we're leading now. With again pivoting on what Gerard said, obviously the degree to which the strategic direction of the fund shifts into mainstreaming this, will definitely have larger authority and sort of scope to do that. We respond to targets set by our board. The board is comprised of board members, and our partners respond to those targets too. So having clear strategic direction, I think, helps everyone get aligned, and there is a very great value, I think, an opportunity there for these directions to be stronger, specifically in the next replenishment cycle, so 2028 onwards, I believe.
Thanks so much, Ramona. And it's good to hear that kind of flexibility around M&E structures, because one of the challenges I think project proponents often have is struggling to assign budget for local level kind of engagement on M&E and not being as extractive, but finding that balance is quite tricky. I've just realized I'm a terrible chair and we actually only have about 6 minutes left in this session. So, and we've only answered one question. So maybe Argo, jumping to you and flipping to the second question, which is around ensuring we're not reinventing the wheel. So how can we build on all of the great work that's happened over decades for community-based adaptation, decentralized climate finance approaches as we move forward in this kind of new era, how we streamline and build on each other's work rather than always feeling like we have to start from scratch?
Thanks, great question. So I think if you want to make sure money is going more local level with increased downward accountability, but minimum burden, I think what we really need to do as a community is move away from project-based financing for adaptation, because this project-based financing doesn't really help us. It's always the reporting will be burdensome, right? And it also doesn't ensure continuous flow of money because it has an end start date and an end date. So the way I see it, I mean, you guys talked about this financing in the context of uncertainty. So if countries have systems to deliver local development, if the systems may not be perfect, but one can build on the systems, strengthen the systems, and ensure the same systems are delivering adaptation and local development hand in hand, so that ultimately the benefits are in terms of increased job and improved health, improved well-being, etc., while of course factoring climate shocks and stresses. So for me, working through that systems, and there are innovative ways of financing those systems, whether through results-based financing, whether through looking at budget support, which doesn't require to be burdensome in terms of reporting lines, but ensures this continuous flow of money is there on delivery of certain kind of results that are articulated by the local communities and stakeholders. For me, this move away from project-based financing is very critical to move on. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Argo. I think it's a critical point, but one of the challenges is, of course, the systems that we've built are all based on project-based financing. So how we kind of shift those systems will be a real challenge. Anna, jumping over to you, and maybe switching track a little bit again, and not to pick on you as kind of the private sector rep, but your thoughts on how we can meaningfully engage and bring the private sector in, crowd those resources into adaptation, and more specifically, the local level adaptation seems to be a really critical gap at the moment in the conversation.
Sure, thank you. I think from the private sector perspective, I guess speaking from like foundations that are in our network, the challenge is often that they will have quite specific mandates around, like depending on where that funding is from. If it's a family foundation, those mandates will be set by their family board, that kind of thing. So often what I find in these conversations when you're trying to convince funders to fund something a bit different is like they're very strictly limited by those mandates. So I would say more kind of bridging of silos between the adaptation sort of community and some of those other communities around like climate funding, but also like we're a biodiversity funder primarily. We don't frame ourselves as an adaptation funder, but you can very easily start framing biodiversity conservation work as adaptation funding. So I think like thinking about how to frame this work not with necessarily the language that you've always used within the adaptation sector, and thinking about framing it in ways that might work for people that aren't, because I find a lot of this language actually very foreign to me, having not been in this sector. So maybe just some external feedback that can be framed maybe with some different hats on to bring different audiences in. And I will just speak super quickly to the localizing. I guess one point I would make is kind of network building has been really key for us. So building trust means kind of building understandings of organizations working within a space, and also bringing decision making down as close as possible to the community level. And so you'll see there are many more intermediaries popping up. We are also an intermediary, but intermediaries I think can be really, really powerful in bringing genuine local knowledge to the decision making around how grant funding is being used.
Thanks, Anna. And noted on the narrative side of things, we are a very jargon-based industry, aren't we? So looking at ways that we can kind of not necessarily simplify, but change our language so that it connects with different kinds of actors, I think is critically important. So Saliha, we're going to jump to you for a final word before May is going to have the unenviable task of trying to summarize this really fascinating conversation. Touching on the third question that came up in the chat, and I think it's quite a pertinent one for the Adaptation Fund, as a grant-only and public financed institution, where do you see things going in terms of how we can scale locally led approaches over time in a context of that public finance shrinking?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Paul. I think that that's something that we are intensely thinking about. And at a very local level, what we're seeing is that the grant funding that we provide have the ability to make an impact. The question is, what happens when the funding runs out? And will the impact continue to be sustained? And so what we're seeing in some instances, actually in many projects, if we're, let's say, working with, and I think this is probably well known in this space, that households, small business owners, smallholder farmers often bring in, so for initiatives that are showing impact, they will co-finance. They will bring their own funding into making the home more resilient to storms, or investing in agricultural practices, tools, seeds, whatever that is that is helping them become more resilient. And these kinds of things actually have a intended, unintended, positive consequences. That is one part of it. But I think what happens is, and we're hoping to see this more and more, is gradually an ecosystem begins to fill out, a financial ecosystem begins to fill out. So once you have this dynamic established, okay, we are now investing in more climate resilient practices. Now it's making the household, small business more sustainable as an asset, or as an income generating venture, then it's much easier on that basis to get a loan to essentially grow that and proliferate those assets, or increase the business. So this is one way in which we're hoping that grant support, which of course can handle, can take on risk and will invest in areas where that are not traditionally perhaps attractive, and overcome that barrier, that then it becomes sufficiently attractive, hopefully, for additional sources of finance. And that's where we are optimistic and hopeful that there will be scaling up energies coming our way. Thank you.
Thanks, Saliha. I think that's a really useful point to then start to wrap up on, that idea of being hopeful and energetic, and really kind of you know, finding ways to push forward regardless of the context. Because you know, if we don't do this as a global community, then things are only going to get worse. So you know, there's a real challenge ahead of us. We are slightly over time, but I'm going to throw to my colleague May, who is going to give us a 1-minute wrap up of all of the really interesting stuff that's happened here. I know there's been a lot going on in the chat as well, so we will try and download all of that and share it with you afterwards as well. Over to you, May.
Okay, very hard to wrap up because we had such a rich discussion by the panelists and active side chat. So thank you everyone for engaging in the breakout rooms and also in the side chats. A couple of things I'll highlight. Strengthening key institutions and not reinventing the wheel was something I heard a lot, with particular emphasis on strengthening government systems and basically using the systems that already exist in country and strengthening them, building capabilities, and also making sure that they can sustain over time, so that they can support the national context within which they work. Another thing I heard was how important it is to incorporate co-design and participatory approaches in program design, but also in systems rethinking, reshaping. And in order to do this, there needs to be budgeting support. And that was highlighted through a lot of conversations, that budget is needed in order to make sure that systems can incorporate the co-design approaches and the participatory approaches. There was also a need for better programming and flexibility, so less onerous M&E requirements, but also more flexible ways in which programming is done, in order to enable governments, national governments, to learn and adapt in their own way. And then lastly, network building, understanding who the different actors are, what special roles they play in leveraging the different stakeholders and the context within which they work to better enable LLA.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, May. I think it was a really nice summary of where we landed, and a really rich discussion. So please join me in giving a round of applause to our esteemed panelists, or a round of emojis or whatever comes up when you press the reaction button at the bottom. That was a big explosion of hands, so fantastic. It's been really great having you all here. So in an hour from now, we will come back into plenary. We didn't have to rush. We had a whole hour we could have used. We will come back to the middle plenary, where we'll have a catch up on what's happened in the 4 sessions that have occurred so far today, and a look forward to where we'll go in the afternoon. So hopefully many of you can come back online in an hour. Some of you may be more awake, some of you may be less awake, and we look forward to seeing you there and across the day. Thank you so much for your engagement and for experimenting with us with a flipped panel idea. We hope that you did have some interesting conversations in your groups, and that you found this conversation interesting in the broad. So thank you again, and again, thank you so much to our panelists. We hope to see you all again soon.